voices of the slaves themselves. And it's a fascinating insight often into the intimacy of Cape domestic life, amongst a whole lot of other issues. He also co-edited The Pre-Industrial Cape in the 21st Century with Laura Mitchell. He's produced numerous articles on the VOC, and as I said, he's on the cutting edge of research now. There is really exciting new work has been coming out on the VOC, on the Dutch East India Company, in the last, certainly under 10 years. And Gerald has been at the forefront of this. And this work has transformed our understanding of the Cape during this period. So welcome, Gerald, and thank you.
Can you all hear me? Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the warm welcome. I gave a similar talk, I think almost 10 years ago, but that talk was only about trials of slavery, which was fairly new then. It came out in 2005, and I think this was about 2008 or 9. And I'm always glad to talk about two things I'm passionate about. The one is early Cape history, particularly the VOC period, and the other one is the Riebeeck Society. And I can combine these two things. I have a PowerPoint here. Let me just see if it's working. Yeah. These days of blended learning, people like me who are in universities now are constantly barraged to blend their learning, so to use a lot of technology and imagery and stuff in their lectures. And we're always told you're not allowed to put long text on PowerPoints. But I know from experience that the audiences at the summer school here have superior powers of concentration. So I have decided to ignore that. There will be quotes here and even longer quotes in the handout. So the screen is only so big, so I decided to make a handout with to put some of the quotes I have here in context. So if you didn't get one, I think they're at the front door. So my talk tonight has 4 parts. I will start with a brief story about beginnings. It's partly about the beginning of slavery as an institution in South Africa, but also about the beginning of the Riebeeck Society, because in this lecture series we're using the Riebeeck Society to get a view on the past. And secondly, then I will have a brief overview of Cape history, Cape slave history, putting it all in context. In the third part, I want to look at eyewitnesses from the outside who visited the Cape, and then finally turn to some evidence from slaves themselves, so we can hear the slave voices, even though they may be mediated. So, in the same way that Cape slavery has permeated most of South Africa, so too did that topic form part and parcel of the publishing activities of the Riebeeck Society over the past century. So this lecture series, as you know, is to celebrate the 100 years of the VRS. I counted, and it figured at least 41 of the 98 volumes published by the VRS contains something on slavery. In fact, the very foundation of the Riebeeck Society in 1917 to 1918 was linked up with another anniversary, namely the momentous decision 2 centuries before, in the 18th century, that the Cape economy, and thus also its society, will be predicated upon slavery. It is worth spending a few minutes looking at some extracts from the very first volume of the Riebeeck Society, called The Reports of Chavon and His Council, and of Van Imhoff at the Cape. So in 1716, the directors of the Dutch East India Company sent a questionnaire to the then governor and council of the Cape concerning some economic initiatives. The VOC was a business company, and they were always concerned about saving money somewhere. One of the first questions was, and I quote, whether European farmhands and agriculturist farmers would be less expensive than slaves. And all of the members of the Council of Policy, including the governor, had to send their comments on these questions. And with the single exception of Captain Dominique de Chavon, who was the brother of the governor then, all the members insisted that the Cape could not survive without slavery. De Chavon, however, argued passionately for the opposite. which he believed would have a salutary effect on the development of the settler population. And it is worth quoting something from his answer. It's much longer, but I want just to highlight a few things, and I will return to this later in the lecture. And he said, if the further importation of slaves were prohibited and people were gradually to accustom themselves to employee Europeans or Dutchmen born in this country as farm labourers, I am certain that it would be of advantage to the company, the VOC that is, the country and the inhabitants. Moreover, one must consider the tranquility enjoyed by the inhabitant who is served by his own people. I should also like to point out the dangers, the expense and troubles which residents in the country districts have to endure because of the slaves. For example, conspiracies among the slaves who run away in bands, generally at harvest time, and leave their masters in the lurch. At the same time, they are a nuisance to the farmer, his cattle and possessions, and they cannot be caught without heavy loss to their owners, and then they have to be punished, as our sentence books, with their many sad examples bear witness. And later on in this lecture, we will go back to some of those sad examples in the sentence books. Later on, this first volume of the Riebeeck Society was introduced by J.X. Merriman, who was the former Prime Minister of the Cape Province, or the Cape Colonies was then, and he was also the founding chair of the VRS. And he wrote in his introduction that it is regrettable, and I quote, that this opportunity was not made better use of, and that South Africa was not placed upon the foundations of the North American colonies, implying that South Africa's history may have been very different had the Chavons' ideas been taken up with. To drive the point home, the Van Riebeeck Society included in this first volume a report by Baron van Imhoff, who was the Governor-General of all of the East Indies, and on his way to the East Indies he acted as the commissioner at the Cape, as they always did, and he had to write a report on the Cape. So this is about 25 years or so after this report by de Chavon. So van Imhoff opines that, I believe it would have been far better had we, when this colony was founded, commenced with Europeans and brought them hither in such numbers that hunger and want would have forced them to work. But having imported slaves, every common or ordinary European becomes a gentleman and prefers to be served than to serve. We have, in addition, the fact that the majority of the farmers in the colony are not farmers in the real sense of the word, but owners of plantations, and that many of them consider it a shame to work with their own hands. Be that as it may, slavery remained a reality at the Cape for almost another century after van Imhoff's report, as can be read in almost every volume that the Van Riebeeck Society published on early South African history up to the 1830s. Now, in this brief focus that I've just outlined on discussion of slave labor in the first half of the 18th century, we have some eyewitnesses to slavery from the side of officialdom, those in charge of governing the colony. In the rest of my talk today, I will highlight some eyewitness testimonies we get from visitors to the Cape and from settlers and slaves themselves. But before we do so, I just want to give a brief little background or context on the history of slavery at the Cape. Now, maybe let me just quickly go forward. I like this map very much. It's a contemporary map from the 18th century. You can see it's in Dutch. There it says Dutch miles. You can also see the age. Here's Australia, Hollandia Nova. Australia got its name, I read by coincidence this morning, in 1804. So this is the Dutch East Indies. So this is Indonesia, parts of Southeast Asia. They had forts and stations in Vietnam, in Thailand, and what is now Singapore, Malaysia, and also a lot of trading. Ceylon also was a Dutch colony, and some parts here of South India as well. So the Cape was founded by the Dutch, or the station at the Cape was founded in the context of this empire, which has been in existence since the early 17th century. So by the time the VOC established a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, slavery was a well-established institution in its empire in the Indian Ocean. Jan van Riebeeck, the first commander who had previously served in the East, was therefore well familiar with the use of slave labor. During the first few years of his tenure at the Cape, when he was struggling with his few men to do the heavy work of building a fort and trying to farm and producing provisions for ships, he often requested directors of the VOC to send some slaves to the Cape, and he said they should bring them from the East. He even at times considered capturing the Khoikhoi to use them as slaves, but his superiors forbade this. But finally, in 1658, the first major group of slaves were imported to the Cape. They came from what is now the country of Dahomey, which was then called Guinea in West Africa, and another bunch came a few months later from Angola. Thus, the first slaves in South Africa came from West Africa, but this Atlantic origin of slaves was an exception to the history of Cape slavery, and all slaves subsequently came not from the Atlantic Ocean, but from the Indian Ocean world. So this part of the world. So the VOC also, for a while, Mauritius was also part of the VOC empire, and they had an outpost at one point in what is now Maputo. So the VOC was involved in all of the Indian Ocean empire. Where did these slaves come from, and how did they come to the Cape? So in the century and a half after this, after 1658, slaves were brought to the Cape in three ways. Firstly, VOC-sponsored slave voyages from Madagascar, and in the last decades of the 18th century from Mozambique, where they would send a ship from Cape Town to those places to trade slaves. Secondly, the return fleets from the East Indies. So every year, a whole group of ships will sail together from Batavia, what is now Jakarta in Indonesia, and some of the people on these ships will take some of their own slaves, their personal slaves, and because slavery was prohibited in the Netherlands, would sell them at the Cape, so they can have their service at least halfway of their journey back home. And these slaves were normally sold to private individuals at the Cape. And thirdly, and this becomes a huge source of slaves for the Cape in the late 18th century, foreign slave ships who stopped at the Cape on their way to the Americas from the slave markets in East Africa, particularly Mozambique and Madagascar. So, for instance, Brazil needed vast amounts of slaves. They would send ships to go to the east coast of Africa, trade slaves there, and a few of them they might sell in Cape Town on their way back to Brazil. Now, where did these slaves come from? It is important to keep in mind that over the 150-year period of slaves, the slave trade to the Cape, the origins of Cape slaves changed continually. If you take all of the numbers together, taken globally, so all of the slaves who were imported to the Cape over this period counted together, slaves come in more or less equal numbers from four areas. Madagascar, and particular, I'll talk in a moment about the company slaves, what they are, but particularly company slaves came from Madagascar. A second group from India and Ceylon, South Asia. Thirdly, the Indonesian islands, and fourthly, Mozambique. However, different regions were preponderant at different times. Thus, during the late 17th century and the early decades of the 18th, most Cape slaves originated from Madagascar and India, while in the middle decades of the 18th century, they tend to come mostly from Indonesia, and from the late 18th century from Mozambique and further east, Zanzibar and places like that on the east coast. Now, one of the things that makes Cape slavery very different from the very familiar institution in the Atlantic world is the small scale of it, by which I don't mean the small numbers imported, but the fact that you have very small numbers of slaves working on farms. So most of the slaves were brought to the Cape as individuals or in small groups. The consequence of this was twofold. One is that the number of slaves grew very slowly, and the other is that given the diverse origins of Cape slaves and the fact that they mostly arrived as individuals, there was little opportunity for a unified slave culture or a feeling of solidarity to develop. And these are the reasons which historians give why there are no huge-scale slave uprisings at the Cape, unlike in the Atlantic world. We'll come back to these two small examples of this later on. So the population at the Cape grew slowly, but from the first decade of the 18th century, the number of slaves at the Cape slightly outnumbered that of European colonists at the Cape, but never by much. So actually, the very time period when the Chavon and his council took the decision to keep slavery, that was the first decade, if you look at it on a graph, that the number of slaves take over the number of Europeans. But it was never hugely so. It was always like maybe 5 to 10% more slaves than European colonists. Although one must keep in mind that often the numbers of slaves was underreported for tax reasons. So someone like Robert Shull argues that we should have actually double the numbers that we have in the official records. But that aside. So by the end of VOC rule at the Cape in 1795, there were just under 17,000 slaves in the colony in comparison with 15,500 freeburgers. And it has been calculated by somebody like Robert Shull that from 1652 to 1808, the end of the slave trade, in total 63,000 individuals were imported to the Cape as slaves. Now, the slaves of the population, the slave population at the Cape was divided into two groups, and you'll often find it in the sources, so it can be a bit confusing when they talk about company slaves. What do they mean by this? So the company slaves are those that belonged to the VOC, and the fact that they would generally come in groups and in bigger groups and tended mostly to originate from Mozambique and later on Madagascar and later on Mozambique, it meant that they formed a much more homogeneous group. They had the same origins, they often spoke the same languages. These are the only slaves that you find who often have the original names. All the other slaves were given names by their owners. You know, like today you would give your dog a name when you get it. That happened with private slaves, but VOC slaves often had the original names from Madagascar or Mozambique. It also helped the fact that most of them, the majority of them, lived in the slave lodge in Cape Town. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. The numbers here fluctuated, the number of slaves in the slave lodge, but at any given time there were between 450 and 600 slaves living in this building, which is of course today the Slave Museum in Cape Town, and formerly the High Court or the Supreme Court of the Cape. This is how this facade here was built in the early 19th century. This is how it looked in the 18th century when the slaves lived here. It was nothing so fancy. And so this is the graveyard of the Grote Kerk, which is of course next door. At first, in the first few decades, until about 1670s, 80s, the number of VOC slaves far outnumbered those owned by private individuals. But this soon changed when the number of private slaves grew rapidly, so much so that by the end of the VOC period in 1795, only 3% of all Cape slaves belonged to the VOC. The rest were all private slaves. And of course, when the British took over in 1795, they abolished the slave lodge, and they sold all the VOC slaves off. Because of the way in which private slaves landed at the Cape, normally in small numbers at a time, like drips and drabs, it meant that their makeup was much more heterogeneous than that of the VOC slaves. A further division among slaves was between urban and rural slaves. So slaves who worked in urban households generally had greater freedom of movement and above all had more opportunity to meet and interact with other slaves. So you can imagine, if you live in Cape Town, you send your slaves to go and get water from the well. That slave may chat to other slaves along the way. They might have relationship with other slaves, and so on and so forth. When you are isolated on a farm, as happened in the interior, where you have maybe 4 or 5 slaves on a farm, the chances of you actually finding somebody who comes from the same part of the world as you, those chances are quite slim. So it was therefore possible for urban slaves to keep up ties and develop friendships with people who share the same origins and languages. Slaves on farms in the interior were generally much more isolated from other slaves, and they had fewer opportunities to interact with other slaves. While in general they were also much more in contact with Khoisan labourers on farms. And this is one of the reasons why you have later in the 18th century mixed race group of people, so-called Bastard Hottentotten, developing because of intermarriage between Khoisan and slaves. Private ownership was not evenly spread throughout the colony. The greatest concentration of private slaves were found in Cape Town and in the Cape District, which also included what is now called the Swartland, Malmesbury, that area. Then in the agrarian part of the southwestern Cape, so Stellenbosch, Paarl, a bit further north, a bit to the South Cape. But on the frontiers, the pastoral frontiers to the north and the south, there were only very few slaves, since these farmers relied much more on Khoi labour. Now, an important factor to keep in mind is the fact that individual slave holdings remained very small. Only the very wealthiest owners owned more than about 20 slaves, while the majority of farmers had fewer than 10, and some mainly only 2 or 3 or so. In general, wheat and wine farmers owned more slaves than those farmers who practiced pastoralism. A major consequence of the fact, coupled with the diverse areas of origins of imported slaves and the variety of languages that they spoke and the cultures that they brought with them, is that a single distinctive slave culture of the kind that you find in North America did not develop here in the Cape. Now, in the British period, in 1795, as most of you know, Britain conquered the Cape in the context of the Napoleonic Wars. And except for a 3-year interregnum when the Cape reverted back to the Batavian Republic, which is the name of the Netherlands while it was under Napoleonic rule, it remained in British hands till 1910. At first, the British tried to maintain institutions, and the slave trade continued unabashed until it was prohibited by the British Parliament in 1807. And this act had a major impact on Cape slave society, as the availability and thus the value of slaves increased dramatically. Although there was little support for abolitionist activities among most Cape settlers, but there are some notable exceptions to this, like Thomas Pringle, who came with the 1820 settlers. He was very active in the abolitionist movement, and the VRS recently published a volume of his letters. So, although there, as I say, was little enthusiasm for abolitionism, legislation passed by the British Parliament meant that there was a gradual amelioration and improvement in the condition of slaves. And in fact, in 1816, a senior official was established called the Slave Protector, whose job it was to make sure that these laws are adhered to. And if slaves were treated badly, they could go to the Slave Protector and he could prosecute owners. In 1834, as you know, slavery was officially abolished, but as elsewhere in the British Empire, was followed by a 4-year period of apprenticeship, which in essence tied former slaves to their owners, and now they became wage labourers. Okay. So now I want to move to some eyewitness accounts which will illustrate some of the particulars I just mentioned. And this is the sections where we will look more closely at some of the excerpts that I gave on the handout. In this section, I focus on travellers and visitors to the Cape whose descriptions, journals and diaries were published by the VRS over the past centuries. I arranged the excerpts chronologically, but I would like you to trace 2 golden threads throughout them. There are like 6 or so of them. Firstly, you can see the development of this notion that Cape slavery was somehow mild and paternalistic. It's not as bad as it is in the West Indies or in South America. So you can see this idea developing in the course of the 18th and 19th century through these excerpts. And secondly, try and trace the gradual divergence between views on slavery as held by the Cape inhabitants versus those Europeans who come and visit the Cape. I have chosen these excerpts not only to show the wide variety of visitors to the Cape and their differing views, but also because I wish to contrast these opinions of non-slave owners with how slaves themselves experience in their lot, which is the last part of what we'll look at tonight. So let's first look at this man called Otto Menzel, who's a very interesting character. He's a German soldier who served at the Cape, and at one point he worked as a schoolmaster to a senior official here. And then he went back. He was here for about 7 years in the 1730s. And then very much later, in about the 1780s, he published his memoirs of his time at the Cape, a 3-volume work called The Topographical Description of the Cape. And this work of his was kind of in reaction to an anonymous piece of work which was published on the Cape. And it remains one of the most thorough and detailed accounts of Cape society in the early 18th century. So you can see, I'm only going to read a little bit here from him, but here you can see originates the idea that different slaves groups had different lots. I've just been telling you about the difference between company slaves on the one and private slaves and urban slaves and so on. So here is this is the origin of this idea that the VOC slaves are the worst off, private and rural slaves are a bit better, but the urban slaves are the best. So Menzel writes in the 1780s, but going back to his time in the 1730s, it is not an easy matter to keep the slaves under proper order and control. The condition of slavery has soured their tempers. Most slaves are a sulky, savage, and disagreeable crowd. Firmness as well as tact is required to keep them subdued. The slaves belonging to the company are undoubtedly the most rascally of all. Those slaves who are owned privately are, with few exceptions, much better treated and much more amenable to good treatment. And then he talks a little bit about town slaves. I'm just going to read the first sentence or so. In the town there are some household slaves of a far superior type. They are well-behaved, diligent, and devoted to their masters, who return this fidelity with kind treatment and frequent presents. I don't know how frequent those presents were, but yeah. So here you see also the beginning of this idea that Cape slavery is not so bad. It may be terrible for the people in the VOC lodge, but they are a rascal bunch and so they kind of deserve this. But if you treat your slaves kindly, they will love you, and so on and so forth. And we will see how this idea lives on in the course of the 18th century. I believe you talked about Sparrman last night, eh? Yeah. So you all know, of course, Sparrman was here in the 1770s, a student of Linnaeus, the great botanist, and very much a young man, very much at the forefront of Enlightenment thought. He's read his Rousseau and his Voltaire, and he is at the forefront of new thinking about the world. And he encounters slavery here, and he is very, very vicious about it. And he writes at quite length, in very great detail, about how owners punish their slaves. I'll just read a little bit. I have known some colonists, not only in the heat of their passion, but even deliberately and in cool blood, undertake themselves the low office of not only flaying both the backs and limbs of their slaves by a peculiar slow lingering method, but likewise, exceeding the very tigers in point of cruelty, throw pepper and salt over the wounds. But what appeared to be more strange and horrible was to hear a colonist not only describe with great seeming satisfaction the whole process of this diabolical invention, but even to pride himself on the practice of it, and to rack his brain in order to find sophism in defense of it, as well as of the slave trade. And this individual, I am pretty sure that he's talking about here, is Duminy, Jean-Pierre Duminy, who was a senior official in the VOC and as a sideline had a slave trading business. The VRS also published some of his documents and his wife's diary. And then he goes on and describes more parts of about slave torture and so on and so forth. And then he gets to this very interesting part here, which I will come back to later in the talk. The slave who is punished for sedition is always, in the eyes of his fellow slaves, a martyr that suffers for the common sense and for having maintained the dearest rights bestowed upon them by nature, which is their liberty. Spikes, wheels, red-hot pincers, and all the rest of the horrid apparatus employed by the executioner will never have with the sufferers the effect of convincing them of the contrary doctrine. So basically, that slaves, they somehow have heard these ideas from the Enlightenment that liberty is all that counts, and they will die for this idea. Now, of course, whether this is the case or not is something else, and of course, as always, as I think Dr. van Heyningen told you on Monday, as a historian, you have to ask, who is he writing for? This book is not being written for slaves to read the Cape. The audience is the enlightened elite of Europe. And this is kind of a demonstration of how bad things are in some other parts of the world. But I'm coming back to this. I just want to show you quickly. Here is a picture from 1764, about 10 years or so before Sparrman comes here. So here's the castle, which still exists. And this is more or less Buitengracht Street. Not Buitengracht, what am I saying? And here is the place of execution. Here you can see the spikes and the wheel on which people were tortured and so on. So when slaves or people were sentenced to be punished, the Council of Justice would stand on this bastion, and they will look at and make sure that justice is being done as the sentence stipulated. Moving forward another 20 or so years is the testimony of Lady Anne Barnard. And this is her very first sight of slaves. So she gets here and she says, the first indication of slavery to my freeborn eyes and the opposite ranks in human life here trotted past us. And then she describes a slave who goes out and collects wood, and he collects some wood for himself, which he sells, and so on and so forth. But look here, that she admits that she is looking at it from the side of a European. And at first there is a great deal of sympathy and horror for what's going on. But then she kind of changes her tack a few sentences later. And she says, new to me as the appearance of those poor slaves were, I could not help feeling more pity for them than I thought perhaps that I was justified for afterwards, when I saw the kind manner in which the Stromboms, it's a Dutch family, and some of my acquaintances treated theirs. So much the reverse of what I have heard of the hardship shown those in the West Indies. So you can see here that by when it's 1797, how this idea that Cape slavery is mild compared to the rest of the world is well entrenched. It's even somebody like Lady Anne Barnard, who of course comes from Scotland, who is a product of the Scottish Enlightenment as well. Even she kind of, after living here a while, because this journal was revised when she went back to Scotland, she kind of changes her tack in saying that maybe it's not so bad here. This is a fairly recent publication by the Riebeeck Society about Russian visitors who came to the Cape. There were also occasionally Russians who passed the Cape and wrote their memoirs and descriptions of the Cape, and until recently, of course, they were not easily accessible, but they've now been translated into English. Golovin visits the Cape in 1808-1809, which is, of course, significant because this is right after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, so it takes effect in 1809. His opinion is that the local Dutch main vice is the cruelty with which many of them treat their slaves. Prior to the act of the British Parliament forbidding the trade in humans, the wretched victims were brought out for sale here from all over the world. The slaves in this colony are kept very poorly. They are dressed in rags, even those who serve at the table of their masters. It is said that since the British ordered limits to the cruelty in the treatment of the slaves by their masters and forbade trade in blacks, they keep them better and exercise more care for their health. The motive for such a change was undoubtedly avarice, not not kindliness. So this is another thread that you see running through it, right, going back to the Chavon and his council, is that it's all about economics. Forget about kindliness and Enlightenment ideals and stuff. It's all about money. And then the final European I want to look at is one that's not so well known, M.D. Teenstra, who's a Dutchman who spent about a year at the Cape in 1825. And here again we have somebody who is very much aware, a product of the Enlightenment, very much aware of the recent history of Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, all the revolutionary wars and so on and so forth. And he demonstrates in this passage how little sympathy there was for abolition among the colonists, and how after more than a century, economic arguments were still used to justify the institution at the Cape. And so just a little excerpt. However kindly and generous, hospitable, humane and religious the Cape Townians are, they strongly resent any attempt to criticize slavery. They immediately tell you that you have brought your European prejudices against slavery with you, and that you are not in a position to form an unbiased opinion on the subject. They assert that the slave trade is approved by God and the Bible, and that emancipation would bring misery upon the masters as well as upon the slaves. And then he explains why. They represent, the colonists represent that the slaves are well cared for because that is in the owner's own interest, that they are reconciled to their position, and that they cause no trouble unless stirred up by having false notions of liberty instilled in their heads. And then he talks a bit, and I've unfortunately had to leave this out, about what we now call Holland's rebellion, who is a slave who lived in the Koerbokkenveld, so to the north here, on a farm called Houdenbeck, whom some of you may know. Andre Brink wrote a novel. It's one of his most famous early novels called Houdenbeck. I don't know what what is it called in English? I forgot.
Chain of Voice.
That's right, yes. And this is the farm, Houdenbeck, in which there was this uprising by Holland. So he talks a little bit about it. He actually, Teenstra, Holland, this happened in 1825, and Teenstra actually visits Holland in prison. In Roland Street, and he then writes a bit about what he tells him and so on. So in the light of this, Holland's rebellion, and I'm quoting again from Teenstra, it is intelligible that the slave owners dislike discussing emancipation, both for the fear of such talk coming to the ears of the slaves, and because they are, for reasons of self-interest, completely opposed to such a measure. They declare, and then we go into that usual economic argument, that slaves constitute the principal wealth of the colony. Okay, so much then for some outsider's view of slavery. I now want to go and look, and most of this will come, or all of it will come from the volume Nigel Wooden and I edited called Trials of Slavery, and look a bit at the voices, the eyewitnesses of slaves themselves. So thus far, all our witnesses are from outside. No voice of a slave we've heard thus far. In the Cape, we don't have, in Cape history, a strong tradition of so-called ego documents. These are diaries and letters and things like that from the colonial period, especially from the Dutch period. There are a few, like the Diary of Adam Tas, the Dumini Diary that I mentioned before, the correspondence of Klute and Swallen Gerald, but there's not a lot of it. And I've tried to look for nice excerpts from them. Slaves are there all the time, but they're kind of in the background. They are just mentioned in passing. And slavery ended too early at the Cape for us to have oral sources. So because slavery ended so late in the USA, for instance, 1865, in the early 1900s, people could go and talk to elderly slaves and collect their testimonies. And there's a huge industry in those slave testimonies from oral history in the US, but we don't have that either. There is, however, a vast archive of official records. Most, however, relate to the business and legal affairs of the colony. But it is in these legal documents that we sometimes hear slave voices directly or indirectly as part of the evidence. These sources are, of course, tainted and problematic. They were created not for us to read about slaves, but to sentence somebody for a crime. So they have a very specific reason. But sometimes in between all the testimony, we get little nuggets of gold about the slave experience. Okay, there are very few documents by slaves which actually survive. This is because slaves were generally illiterate. There are some interesting exceptions. There are about 4 or 5 that I know of which survived in the archives in one way or another. A couple of them we discovered while we were working on trials of slavery. Here is one from 1719. And it's not, I must make this clear, it's not the slave who wrote this himself. He paid somebody to do this. Just like in many illiterate societies, you have a scribe and you pay that person and he will write a letter for you. And in this letter, we have the voice of the slave. And he writes to his mistress, "Your obedient slave gives notice with all humility and sadness of heart, with the presentation to you of how he has served you since fully 10 years ago now, with faithful service, without complaining to anybody. Consequently, he is beseeching you, and this part is underlined in the manuscript, with hands clasped and knees bent, praying humbly that it would please you to look upon him in keeping with your innate mercifulness, with the eyes of compassion, and to please permit him a letter of freedom." He's asking to be released from slavery, and it's a very sad story. You can read about it in Trials of Slavery. His owner doesn't approve of it, and he kind of attacks her. But what is interesting here is the language of this, the adoption of humility. I'm bending and I'm begging, and you, my owner, is so wonderful, you're innately kind, and so on and so forth. Here is another a discovery which we made when we did Trials of Slavery. This script here is Buji, which is an island. It comes from the island of Makassar. There is a language called Bujinese, but this is not that. The language is actually Arabic, but it's written in Buji script. There's another letter. This comes from 1786, from 1760, which is actually in Bujinese, the language. And this is a very intriguing case. From 1786, where a whole bunch of slaves escaped from Cape Town and they went on a murderous rampage. They killed like almost a dozen of people on their way. And they took this, they planned it very carefully, and they took this as a talisman, as something to protect them. They had an imam kind of blessed it. So you also see in this case kind of the early indications of Islam at the Cape. And the same group of slaves were very clever, and they paid somebody, a boy, to write this letter for them, and it is a so-called padbriefje, a little letter for the road, and it's basically a pass. It tells, because slaves' movement were restricted, they couldn't just go wherever they want, because the suspicion was they were escaping. So what owners did, if they sent him on official business, to give a little letter saying, "This is my slave, I'm sending him to there to do that." And this is what it says here. It's not very good Dutch, but it's basically saying that these slaves called so and so and so are being sent there to the Great Fish River to collect sheep and cattle. And they paid a boy, a schoolboy, his testimony is in Trials of Slavery, to write this letter for them, and it was a ruse to be allowed to travel into the interior. So there are very few of these things, and they are not particularly insightful about the voices of slaves. For that, we have to turn to some of the actual court cases. So let us now look at the other side of the coin. So we've seen in the eyewitnesses from Europeans and the official opinion of the government at the Cape that they say a great deal about the necessity for slave labor and how valuable it is and how they need it and they can't do without it, and also about the treatment of slaves. But how did the other side, how did the slaves actually experience this, and how did this change over time? The documents in Trials of Slavery provide us some glimpses, albeit mediated at times by settlers and legal officers. If you read these, the handout I gave you, you will see that some of these excerpts actually come from settlers or colonists who are saying the slave attacked me and he told me this or that. But that's one of the few ways into this this world. Now, just to show you how skewed our knowledge of slavery is the fact that the vast majority of slaves must have been loyal, because we don't find a whole bunch of uprisings and attacks and stuff like that. The very fact that there are so many court cases on those topics may make you think that, but in reality, most slaves were people like this. So these are slaves, and a slave called Samuel comes to him, and he encouraged them to run away with him. And it's very interesting what they then say. That they did not want to do that, since they have good bazen, the Dutch word masters, and are not in want of anything. The third opponent says that the aforementioned Samuel also came to him at the house of his baas, Francois Retief, and likewise encouraged him to go to their country. But that he refused doing this, saying, I have a good bazen, mistress, why would I run away then? But of course, the fact is that this is a legal case means that these people may well be lying. They may have been considering to go with him, but they don't dare tell this to the judicial officials, because they might be punished. But this is one of the very few things that I know of where you see some inkling of slave loyalty being expressed. Compare this to the vast number of testimonies that we've seen from outsiders who say about, that slave masters treat their slaves so well, the slaves love them, and so on and so forth. The vast bulk of cases, however, deal with very unfortunate and depressing affairs of assault and murder and so on. So I quickly want to look in two cases, 7.2 and 7.3 on the handout, about how some slaves experience what was expected of them. And it demonstrates the contradiction between viewing slaves as productive units on the one hand and their experience as feeling human beings with wants and desires of their own. And one of the saddest cases I know of is this slave whose name we only know is Jan. And he said, we don't have his words, we have a little report. When somebody died or inflicted a wound, the Council of Justice or the Landros in the rural areas would send out a small little commission, and they would investigate it. And this is their report. And they said that after inspection, they discovered that the said slave had a wound on his head going upwards to the temple of the head, which he said he himself had inflicted with a knife because he did not wish to live any longer, saying besides, in essence, I wish to die or to be sold because I cannot keep up with working. Another case from a bit later on, 1759, he also shows a slave who is resisting his owner verbally. The owner once goes out and he discovers that his slave is not working. He went to the garden where he had put his slave Slamat van Boegis to work, and he saw that Slamat was sitting on the ground smoking a pipe of tobacco, and he didn't get up to greet his owner like he should have. The owner then asked Slamat what it was with him, if he ought not to be working. Whereupon Slamat at last stood upright, saying, I am always working. I also have to rest a bit. Adding to this, if boss wants to sell me, go ahead and do it. So this is the other side of slaves as productive units, as people who must labor all the time. Sometimes they don't want to labor, and this is the outcome of it. His owner, you can read it in the excerpt here, his owner attacks him, and he attacks him back, and so on and so forth. Another one, like Jan in the previous excerpt, was so despondent and so depressed that he actually tries to commit suicide, like a lot of slaves did. He just couldn't bear it anymore. Now, going back to Sparrman, who's visiting the Cape in the 1770s, he might have been correct about the slave's desire for freedom during this period, because we do find towards the end of the 18th century increasing indications in court cases of slaves claiming some form of right or rights, and sometimes expressing this through symbolic resistance. And I'm going to give you two interesting cases from the 1790s, but just remember what the context is of the 1790s. This is the era of democratic revolutions. It's after the French, the American War of Independence. It's after the French Revolution. It's the beginning of countries in Latin America wanting their independence. There's talk of ending the slave trade in Britain. So everybody who's sailing around in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean world, are aware of these things. And they come to Cape Town and they discuss this in taverns. Slaves overhear this. So there's a great deal of talk about rights and about freedom and democracy and so on. So let's quickly look at these two cases. The first one deals with a slave called Mentor from Mozambique. This is late 18th century, lots of slaves from Mozambique. And the person talking is Tilleman Ruiz, and he says that he found a slave Mentor from Mozambique about 100 paces from the house, and to whom he said in essence, "Good day, jongen," this is the way of addressing a slave, it means boy, "Good day, boy," while the same did not want to greet him. Whereupon the testifier asked him if he, Mentor, did not greet a Christian. Why does he not greet a Christian person? To which the slave answered by saying, "No, because I am not obliged to greet him, but only my owner and mistress." So here's a slave who is very much aware of the fact that, who are you? I'm not counting you as somebody who has authority over me just because you are a Christian person. I will only pay respect to my owners. A much more dramatic case is that of a slave called Caesar of Madagascar. And the prisoner, this is Caesar, who according to the testimony of his owner has already on several occasions employed outrageous and improper expressions with regard to him, answered him in an impudent way, and indeed, according to the prisoner's own confession, with these words, "I'm going to make my bed just now. There is enough time. I will inspan the cattle early tomorrow." The owner was complaining he hadn't done this. The prisoner's owner hereupon ordered the prisoner to be silent, without this order, however, making even the least impression upon the prisoner, since the prisoner, instead of obeying this, continued on the contrary in an insolent fashion, saying, "I was awoke early enough, but because the weather was bad, I did not want to get up, and I must have my right to speak." An extraordinary thing to say for a slave to his owner, that I must have my right to speak. Needless to say, the prisoner's owner got angry over this answer, and he gave the prisoner a blow, and again ordered him to be silent, to which the prisoner said that he did not want to be silent and would preserve his right to speak. The prisoner's owner then gave him 2 more blows, which did not have any better result, since the prisoner, on receiving these blows, expressed himself in no uncertain terms in this manner: "I do not want to be silent, and I must retain my right to speak," while adding, "Boss must stop beating me like this." So here we have a very clear case of a slave who is aware of his rights, or what he perceives to be his rights, and he's trying to express them, need I say, with no success. The slave was severely punished. Finally, I want to end with a court case which struck me from the moment I first discovered in this. When we worked on trials of slavery, this is the one that I left till the very last to do, because it is such an incredibly disturbing story. But it demonstrates extremely well what Orlando Patterson has called the natal alienation of slaves. So the whole idea that slavery is only successful if you take slaves away from their country of birth and put them in an alien environment, because they have no network there. They cannot survive on their own. It is also this, I'm ending deliberately with this case, because it juxtaposes with the first excerpt I discussed, the Chavon. It's almost just a few years later. And it's one of the saddest cases in the sentence books I know of. Here we have a slave who has basically experienced a form of a nervous breakdown, likely due to suffering what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. It well demonstrates the foreign nature of slavery, or how slaves experience slavery to be so foreign, and the stresses that a new environment and a work regime must have caused individual slaves. And the story goes, it's like a little drama that plays out and goes to and fro a lot. I left out some of the detail, but I do urge you to read it all. It's very, very interesting. So the prisoner, called Cupido van Malabar, a place in India, took up a musket, a kind of gun, and also a box of gunpowder. And when the prisoner's mistress, who was alone at home with her child, saw this, she asked him why he took the musket and what he wanted to shoot with it. And the prisoner replied to this, "I do not want to shoot you, but myself." His mistress said, "In God's name, put it down." While the prisoner replied, "You just pick up your child." The prisoner's mistress then picked up her child and went with it to the voorhuis, the front room of the house. The prisoner put down the musket, followed them, and when he got to the voorhuis, took his knife from his pocket, saying, "What do you want now, that I should murder you or myself?" And then he put back the knife, he put the back of the knife against his throat, asking if his mistress wanted to see him slitting his throat, upon which his mistress earnestly inquired why he wanted to do this and whether something was wrong with him, to which the prisoner gave us answer, so much is wrong with me, I cannot even begin to tell you. And after the prisoner then took off his jacket and his shirt and he threw them down on the ground, he said, pointing to his leather trousers that he was wearing, "I am not used to wearing trousers like these. I have already worked 2 or 3 years here, and I do not see the boss, his owner, buying more slaves, or the nonja, his mistress, buying a slave woman for me. Boss and nonja may talk and laugh very well." So he's complaining about the fact that he has to do everything. He's alone there. There's nobody to talk to. He doesn't have a female companion. The prisoner at this time also told his said mistress that he once went into the room while her husband was lying asleep with the intention to kill him, the husband. But looking at the husband, the prisoner repented because he took pity on his mistress and her child. And then there's a bit more, he goes to and fro and so on and so forth. That after he had done this, the prisoner also said to the mistress, "It would be better if I murder you, your husband, and your child, and that I flay you open like flecked fish, and then do me as well." So here you have a clear indication of something that the slave felt, the experiences to which there were so many witnesses from outside saying slavery is this, slavery is that. Here is the witness, an eyewitness of somebody who experienced slavery himself, and this is what it did to him. And I'll end there. Thank you. Yeah.
If anybody would like to ask any questions.
Yes, sir.
You use the word prisoner here.
Yeah.
And legal term that would be the accused.
No, this is they refer to him as the prisoner in the document. So it's gevangenen in Dutch. In Dutch, yeah.
Because it relates to sentencing.
Yes.
The process before.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but he was from the time that a slave or somebody did a deed until they were sentenced, they were kept in prison. So they were kept. That's why they call it prisoner. Yeah.
You mentioned the number of 63,000 slaves.
Yeah.
In this time span from 1652 to
Yeah.
1808. I think does it only refer to imported slaves?
Yes.
What about their children, for example?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And how many people have been enslaved in their time?
Yeah, that's right. This is the number of people who were brought to the Cape from the outside, and I should add this, for whom we have records. So that's a minimum number. Eh? So this is something like Rob Schall. He has worked out statistical calculations where he says it should actually be considerably higher. But you're right; it doesn't include the natural increase. But also keep in mind that it was a huge problem at the Cape because there was such a gender imbalance. So through most of the VOC period, for every 8 males, there were 2 female slaves. So you do not have a huge increase in slave numbers. It does improve after the abolishment of slavery in 1808, but even by the end of the British period, 1834, slavery in 1834, there were only 3 females for every 7 males. So there was some increase, but it was not nearly as much as, for instance, in the United States, where you have equal gender ratio. Excuse me?
Not any estimate.
Not that I can think of on the top of my head, sorry. Yeah?
I wonder if you can comment on the websites that you can find now the first 50 years.
Yes. No, about it.
Are they
Yeah. No, they're very, very good.
And in the Missa project,
That I don't know, that one. There was a question?
Yes. You said slavery wasn't allowed in Holland.
Yeah.
Why did they have? What was their reason for not allowing it there, but for?
Actually, this is a bit of a moot point. This is a general interpretation. Somebody like Gerald Schutte has argued that there have been cases of slaves being taken to the Netherlands. But basically, it was the idea that this is Christendom, and that slavery is illegal there. But in the colonies, we do things differently. Yeah.
Can I add an addendum to that? It was somewhat similar, I think, in Britain.
Yeah.
There was a very famous case called the Mansfield case.
That's right, yeah.
Which ruled that people could not be enslaved if they were in.
Yeah.
So people would bring slaves from the colonies, but then they had to be released.
It's true.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
I've always understood that our slave records are much richer than the North American ones in some respects, but I've never been clear about the differences. I mean, I know we've got Opva Flora, for instance, these are tax records.
In terms of the legal records, so in the US, for instance, you had slave courts. So these are informal courts on plantations. And some of them kept records, but many of them didn't. Whereas in the Cape, it always had to happen either in the Londres district, Stellenbosch, Graaf-Reinet, or Zululand, or in the Cape. So, and they're often more than one copy of